thing that cannot be known, that if we learn it, if we stumble onto this truth, we lose our minds. That's a reoccurring theme in Lovecraft's fiction. But he has a unique perspective on this that I feel ties to the mad genius trope, and it's this idea of the sensitives. There are several points in supernatural horror and literature, his essay, where he talks about people that can grasp the weird tale, people that have requisite sensitivity to understand weird horror, weird fiction, and they tend to be people that are introspective, emotional, thoughtful, intelligent, somewhat isolated. When Lovecraft is talking about Poe's characters here, this quote about the melancholic, highly sensitive, introspective character, he's really talking about himself, and he's talking about his future characters. You can see he's basically talking about any number of Lovecraftian characters there. Lovecraft himself was interested in art. Pickman's model, which we'll talk about coming up, is basically a love letter to art. He was very interested in it with very specific artists. It was part of his communications, and it is incorporated in several of his stories we'll talk about. But Lovecraft isn't romantic, and it's not this tragic martyrdom for art. Lovecraft is talking about creativity as a risk for madness, a risk for that soul-annihilating truth that we'd be better off not knowing. So there were a handful of stories that I felt started to talk about this mad genius or this connection between creativity and madness. And then there were three very specific ones that I wanted to share. But if you haven't read these, the full cast. In the picture in the house, the paintings that are in the book are brilliant, they're gorgeous, but they're also grisly, and they give knowledge that drives people mad about cannibalism, right? In the music of Eric Zan, the violin player is a genius, but he is constantly seized by frenzied playing to keep the darkness at bay. In Hypnos, the sculptor either was driven mad by his connection to a god and his obsession with the art, or was already suffering and imagined the whole thing. In The Hound, the collectors in The Hound are in a macabre grisly collection. There's a lot of art in it. In fact, Goya is mentioned specifically in the story. Pickman's model, like I said, is heavily influenced by Lovecraft's perspective on art, which is that artists are able to see the world as it really is, and a true gifted artist can express that to regular people. In The Haunter in the Dark, Robert Blake is the stereotypical Lovecraft character. He's a precocious youth, right? He's a brilliant writer and painter, and his sensitivity lures him to his destruction of Admiral's Avenue that walks away. And finally, the Night Ocean, that I talked about at the last symposium we had several years ago. The character in the Night Ocean is a painter who is exhausted after working intensely on a mural, so he seeks isolation in a seaside community and covers weird stuff. So I felt that these stories started to talk about this creativity, madness, and some relationship between them, but there were three that I thought was much more overt. And the first was the thing on the doorstep, where the main character, who is the main action, is about Edward Derby, who is the prototypical Lovecraftian protagonist. He's the precocious youth. He's a genius. He's a very gifted poet. He's highly sensitive. He's so sensitive that he can barely take care of himself, which makes him highly vulnerable to manipulation, and unfortunately leads him into connection with the cult that then results in his destruction. But Lovecraft actually describes him as a sensitive, and it's that requisite sensitiveness that unfortunately leads to his doom. It may have also helped him with his creativity, but the link there is really important. So that's one side of the mad genius prong, where the sensitivity and creativity led to destruction and downfall. Another half of that would be the opposite, and I feel like that is present in Pickman's model. So in Pickman's model, again, Lovecraft is talking about artists throughout the whole piece. He's talking about real artists like Goya, Dorff, Shelley, and their influence on him and their influence on the art world. But then Hickman himself is a genius artist that creates amazing, spectacular, horrific art that drives people mad. The interesting thing here is it's almost the opposite. We later learned, and in later stories we learned that Hickman himself is not human. Hickman is corrupted and unnatural, and it's that, so he's already mad. That has given him great creative ability. So that's where you have the other side of the mad genius hypothesis. And finally, I feel like the best example and balance between this is the Call of Cthulhu, which, if you recall, in the Call of Cthulhu, the investigation begins with Wilcox, who is another precocious youth. He's a very skilled and gifted artist. He's a sculptor. He creates the bust of Cthulhu, and he is struck with a peculiar delirium during March of 1925, where we learn that is the time where Malaga comes from the ocean. But during the course of the investigation, the narrator uncovers that this is a global phenomenon, and that people with that requisite sensitivity actually are also struck with the same delirium. This quote here, I think, perfectly sums it up. So the regular people, mundane people, really didn't experience much except for anxiety. Scientists, maybe being a little more creative, had horrible dreams, but it was from the artists and the poets that the answers came. And so in the investigation, these people, creative people across the world, are struck with delirium, mania, depression, insanity, creative outbursts, and unfortunately destruction, suicide. So I feel the Call of Cthulhu is really demonstrating Lovecraft's perspective on creativity and madness. It's a fictional application of what he was talking about in supernatural horror and literature about requisite sensitivity. So I wanted to close with some notes about this. I know we're pressed for time and rushing through, but this is a major cultural archetype. This idea that there's a link between creativity and illness, creativity and madness. It has influenced us for centuries. It influences how we think about art and how we think about artists. But I want to be clear here, it's actually based on a flawed interpretation of Aristotle and Plato. When we hear those words, melancholia, demon, madness, that's all negative stuff, right? But for the Greeks, there was no negative connotation there. The state of divine mania was actually a sought-after state. It was something that people wanted to be blessed by the gods. Melancholia, at worst, was neutral, and really it was creative energy. So over time, as our understanding and description of these things have changed, keep going back to old quotes that don't actually mean what we think they mean. And ultimately, and I just want to mention this as a clinician, this idea, this perspective is really destructive and harmful. It's very caustic because it allows us to think about suffering of mental illness in a way that people can be ignored. It can be thought of as, oh, that's just the price of being creative. People don't get help, and lives are damaged in a very significant way. It's inaccurate anyway. The science behind this suggests that there may be a relationship, but it's not a beneficial one. It's not a helpful one. And that mental illness doesn't help creativity. And to his credit, even though Lovecraft might have been displaying this in his work, he wasn't all on board with the tragic idea of this. He was looking at creativity and as an example of how we can look into another world, which is a good thing, but if we look too often and too long, it can have consequences. And he may have believed that personally, it's definitely in his humor. And that's what I want to say. So thank you very much.